Someone is responsible for what happened, and I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Alec Baldwin could face up to 5 years in prison if a jury finds that there was criminal negligence in his accidental firing. We know that there was no intent. So the question then comes up, are prosecutors, they're going to be challenged to prove that Baldwin showed willful disregard for others' safety. That's not easy to do. When you're dealing with involuntary manslaughter, that is the unlawful killing of a person without malice, without intent. That's not really something that's under question here. The question is, was the action willful? Was there willful disregard for others' safety? And I think there's actually a very interesting case to make that argument. Certainly in terms of the lead up, all of the incidents that took place, and his position essentially as the creator of the entire project, the person who wrote the script, the person who's the eponymous character, Rust, right? Harlan Rust. He's at the center. It's his baby. It's his project. And he's the to some extent the producer, co-producer, but also one of the major producers of the whole project. He's at the center of the whole thing. Also, he's holding the gun and he's at the epicenter of the whole thing. But I think there's another very interesting case one can make in terms of the whole post-narrative, the whole post-meditation. So if you say willful intent, right, then I think if you look at the narrative, and it's what we covered on this channel, the efforts to control the narrative, the efforts to influence the narrative, and how willful was that, and then take that as a reflection of the potential willfulness and attitude to what is happening. The district attorney, Carmack Altwies, told the Times, that's the LA Times, that Alec Baldwin, this is quoting what she said, that he absolutely had a duty to either check the weapon himself or have someone check it in front of him, and he failed to follow, and then he ultimately failed to follow film set protocols. I think part of that is also pointing the gun at someone, right? That is another obvious one, and then he says, well, I was told to point it at someone. So we are going to be doing a series going into this. Obviously, this case is going to go to trial unless there's a plea deal. And thus far, there has been fighting talk from Baldwin's attorney. But for right now, let's have a look at who was charged. It wasn't only Baldwin and the circumstances surrounding that, and then also who wasn't charged. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do like, share, leave a comment. Bear in mind, I'll also be doing a live where we're going to be looking into some of those. He made a very big statement. I think it aired December 2nd, December 3rd on ABC. He made a very big statement. And I think a lot of those statements are going to come back to haunt him. And so we're going to be looking at the context of those statements that he made in that ABC interview with George Stephanopoulos. Now that we've kind of come full circle. That was before charges were filed. Well, now charges have been filed. What did he say at that time? Let's look at it from the benefit of hindsight and from the perspective of the case going to trial. What could prosecutors glean from those statements? And you could even say, was there a little bit of reckless disregard for the investigation, given that he made the effort to make that interview but hadn't handed over his cell phone at that time and only handed it over sort of in January? And I think they could only extract the information from that cell phone months late after that. And then there was like nothing on the phone. Can one make an argument about willfulness in that regard? So look out for a live. We will be beginning that conversation, and I'll also put a link to the playlist that covers all of the episodes I've done on the Baldwin saga. 87 videos, 88 including this one. If you're enjoying the content in this video, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So on paper, it would have made no sense to not charge Baldwin this late in the game if there was no case to begin with. You wouldn't have the whole thing hovering and pending for months and months, right? And also, if you'd had no intent to pursue charges against the Wealthy Act in the first place. I do think New Mexico would have said they weren't bringing any charges far earlier if that had been the case. So I kind of had the feeling that it was virtually certain that you were going to see charges. And that's based on that behavior, but also on some of the circumstances in the case. For example...
You were in the room when someone was shot?
Holding the gun, yeah.
Okay.
And so what we're likely to see is what we've been seeing and hearing all along. The idea that the gunfire itself. Why was it discharged when that wasn't called for in the script? Also, what are the actor's responsibilities? And again, going back to the pacing of all of this, why did it take so long? I do think it's got something to do with the budget constraints New Mexico have been facing. I think they felt that if they're going to take on Alec Baldwin, they're going to need to have a war chest because they're dealing with a actor that's worth, I think, $60 million. And so I think they've got a slightly larger budget than when this first took place. Now, some people may not be aware of this, but it's not just Alec Baldwin facing charges. It's also the movie's armorer who's facing the same charge. Something else that's very important to bear in mind is there wasn't just a single live round, and that's something that comes up over and over again in his interview with ABC News. How did a single live round end up in the gun? Well, they actually ended up finding hundreds of live rounds when they did a sort of audit of the set. And so if you're talking about willful violation of safety concerns, and there's so much of that going on, plus there's a pattern of accidental discharges. Eventually it's not accidental, is it? And then who's in charge of that? Who should be aware of that? Who should respond to that? So in terms of the coverage from the New York Times, quote, Baldwin has long denied culpability. And, there's been many appearances on Instagram, in the media, on the side of the road, but especially in that ABC exclusive, denying culpability, repeatedly denying culpability. I think he even did it at the Boulder Film Festival. Noting that he'd been told the weapon he was rehearsing with didn't contain live ammunition. So it's Dave Hall's fault because he said cold gun, and that's been disputed. Did he say it, didn't he? And then ultimately he said, someone is responsible for what happened. I can't say who that is, but I know it's not me. And ultimately, how has that turned out? Well, the folks who know the law, whose job is to prosecute the law, have felt differently. I've also felt differently about it. The question is, will they be able to prove it? And it was hardly believable, hardly credible, hardly legally defensible, that interview that he gave. And one does wonder, did he give that under the approval or under the sort of rebelling against the advice of counsel? I can't imagine that a lawyer approved of that in the same way that the Ramsey's interview on New Year's Day, January 1st on CNN, was hardly legally appropriate, right? But basically that interview led to this channel covering this case. We're now at 88 videos, in depth ever since. We were one of the few true crime communities to pursue questions into Baldwin, a notoriously litigious figure, which is why we've covered it quite carefully. Now, another surprise was from Dave Halls, the AD, who did the right thing just very late in the game, and he actually pled guilty to negligent use of a deadly weapon, right? It seems he may have taken a plea deal and thrown his boss under the bus. It's difficult to know, but presumably he may testify against Alec Baldwin. He may have provided certain crucial information, perhaps, for example, that Halls didn't say cold gun, and perhaps Baldwin was asking that he said that. Who knows? So according to the New York Times, the film's first assistant director, Dave Halls, who handed Mr. Baldwin the gun that went off, agreed to plead guilty. And one of the things he said was that he spun the barrel and saw half of the rounds inside of it, but didn't check and make sure. So you kind of got the idea that he's semi-checked. In any event, he's facing a lesser charge, negligent use of a deadly weapon. And so Andrea Reeb, the special prosecutor appointed by the district attorney, said in a statement that if any one of these three people, Alec Baldwin, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed, or Dave Halls, had done their job, Helena Hutchins would be alive today. Now, if you think about that statement, it's basically putting all three of those individuals on a par, and yet Dave Halls gets the lesser charge. Isn't that because of some arrangement? I suppose you could also say if he admitted guilt, he gets a lesser charge, in a sense. And because the other two deny that they did anything wrong, well then, do they deserve the appropriate charge in that case? And so anyway, Andrea Reeb said, it's that simple. The evidence clearly shows a pattern of criminal disregard for safety on the Rust film set. And that's what my coverage has been about, trying to be explicit about. This pattern of disregard for safety, where people sent emails and protested and spoke up about how they felt, and then you had folks higher up in the hierarchy that either didn't seem to take any action or, well, was it disregard for safety? That is exactly what they're going to have to prove. And so Reeb went on to say, in New Mexico, there's no room for film sets that don't take our state's commitment to gun safety and public safety seriously. I think one of the easiest ways to prove this case and to prosecute this case is to basically just look at the laws and protocols surrounding gun safety on film sets. Simple as that. What are those prescriptive rules? Did they follow the prescriptive rules? And we also know that New Mexico's health and safety find the film production the maximum. And so that's already gave you an idea of what was in the offing all along. So these charges now shouldn't be that surprising. And yet you have articles in the LA Times, such as from Nicholas Goldberg, that seems to not be able to understand why accidents happen. Sometimes tragedies happen. Why is it really necessary to take this poor actor to trial? It really seems like some people have a shallow understanding of this case. And so, have we forgotten about anyone? We've spoken about Hannah, Alec Baldwin. There is also Dave Halls. Have we forgotten about anyone? Well, how about Seth Kenny, the arms supplier? What about Hannah's colleague? So they seem at the moment to be off the hook. So what follows from this is that the pending lawsuits against Baldwin may actually gain some teeth as well, including from the gaffer, a good friend of Helena Hutchins, perhaps also the script supervisor. They're going to get some added ammunition because of the state's legal position, right, on this case. I also think what this shows is the attempt by Baldwin to influence and control the narrative, and ultimately his failure to achieve that, to achieve influence and control, despite his celebrity, power, and his wealth. I also think this verdict places Helena's husband, Matthew Hutchins, who is also a lawyer, in an interesting light, because he agreed to settle his wrongful death lawsuit against the Rust production. And under that agreement, he then became executive producer with the whole idea that Rust will go forward. Despite the folks making the movie being accused of, as you've heard, involuntary manslaughter against his wife, he now wants to participate in producing this movie, right? And that's actually set to resume filming this month. Is that going to happen? Should it happen? How's the public going to feel about it happening? How's the crew going to feel about participating in this? Shouldn't you first prosecute this case and see what the law says about it and what justice says, and then decide. And I mean, think about that in terms of willfulness as well. We don't care whether this case is going to trial or what the charges are. We're going to film regardless. Wasn't that the same attitude on set? So I'm not going to take it further than that, just to say it'll be interesting to see if and when the Rust production proceeds. As I said, it's supposed to continue this month. What the public and the industry reception, what is Hollywood going to say about actors just proceeding to finish this troubled enterprise, almost like business as usual? And also, what actual penalties Baldwin and Gutierrez-Reed will face at the end of the day. I can't imagine Gutierrez-Reed will be rehired. Another possibility is that Baldwin may feel like, look, I just want to get this production on the road again, and so perhaps he's initially protesting his innocence, but maybe he'll settle silently in order to just get on with the whole production and get it done and dusted. Does that make sense? Now, I'm going to do a follow-up, as I said earlier, live, where we're going to go through that ABC News interview, but within the context of new information, the legal position of the authorities, and see how that sounds now. Does it ring a little hollow? Does it show Baldwin's sincerity in a different light? Do we believe him more or less than we did at the time? And then we're going to continue this process of following the in-depth legal narrative and possibly even to the trial stage. Time will tell. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.